The air at the Henderson place hung thick and heavy, smelling of dust, defeat, and the cheap cigars of men who came to pick over the bones of another man's life. It was late October 1972. The last of the corn was in, the sky was the color of lead, and the wind had a bite that promised an early winter. I stood at the back of the crowd, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my canvas work coat, watching the auctioneer's rhythmic chant slice through the quiet sorrow of the day. They'd already sold the house, the barns, the good bottom land along the creek. Richard Harrison bought the land, of course. He'd been buying up everything that came available, his signature on the banknotes as bold as the brand-new John Deere green paint on his equipment. He stood near the front, puffed up like a rooster in a new hen house, accepting handshakes and backpats from men who either envied him or owed him. I wasn't there for land. I couldn't compete with the bank's money, and I wouldn't even if I could. My father taught me two things: trust in the Lord and fear the banker. I owned my 320 acres free and clear, a legacy of sweat and discipline passed down from my grandfather. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, not by a long shot, but it was mine. And what was mine, nobody could take. The auctioneer moved on to the machinery line. A tired-looking Farmall 560 with fluid-weeping rear axle seals. An old New Holland haybine. Planters, discs, plows. The usual tools of a life's work, now being scattered to the four winds for pennies on the dollar. I let it all go by. My eyes were fixed on the thing at the very end of the line, half swallowed by the overgrown fence row it had been parked against for God knows how long. It was a combine, a Massey Ferguson 760. And it was a monster, even sitting there, listing to one side on four flat, cracked tires. It was an imposing sight. It was one of the first big V8-powered machines, a real grain-eater in its day. But its day had been a long, long time ago. The big Perkins diesel that should have been in it was gone, replaced at some point with a 390 Ford gas engine that now sat with its hood agape, spark plug wires chewed to nothing by mice. Rust wasn't just on it. It was part of it. The sheet metal was faded to a pale, chalky red. The auger was bent, the feeder house chain was a solid lump of corrosion, and a family of raccoons had clearly taken up residence in the grain tank. To everyone else, it was scrap. $1,000 in iron, maybe, if you could figure out how to haul it away. To me, it was something else entirely. I saw the bones. Good, heavy steel, a simple, rugged design from a time when engineers built things to be fixed, not replaced. A shadow fell over me. Looking at the junk pile, Miller? I didn't have to turn to know it was Rich Harrison. His voice had a smug, oily quality that always set my teeth on edge. I kept my eyes on the Massey. Just looking. You ought to come see my new 7700, he bragged, thumbing a piece of lint off his new insulated vest. Turbo diesel, air-conditioned cab, hydrostatic drive. Got a 6-row cornhead for it. Cost a pretty penny, but you got to spend money to make money. That's the new way of farming, Tom. Get big or get out. I grunted, pulling a hand from my pocket to rub the back of my neck. The cold was starting to seep in. My 40-20 and my old John Deere 55 still get the crop in, Rich. He laughed, a short barking sound. That old junk? Hell, my new rig could harvest your whole farm before lunch and still have time for a nap. You're living in the past. This thing, he said, waving a dismissive hand at the derelict combine, belongs in a smelter. It's a monument to failure. Old man Henderson tried to hang on just like you. Look where it got him. The words stung, mostly because there was a kernel of truth to them. Henderson was a good man, but he'd had a string of bad luck and couldn't keep up. The world was changing fast. The government was telling us to plant fence row to fence row. Grain prices were climbing, and the banks were throwing money at anyone willing to sign their name. It was a heady time, and men like Rich Harrison were riding the wave. I was standing on the shore, watching. Lot 142, the auctioneer called out, his voice tinny through the portable speaker. The Massey Ferguson 760 combine. As is, where is? We're selling it for scrap, boys. What'll you give me for the iron? Somebody give me $500 to start it. 500? 500? Silence. Even the scrap dealers were hesitant. It would cost half that just to cut it up and haul it out. 200 then. $200 for the whole machine. I saw my chance. I lifted a single finger. The auctioneer's eyes lit on me. "I got 200 from Tom Miller. Now 3. Who'll give me 3? The crowd shuffled. A few men turned to look at me, some with pity, some with amusement. Rich Harrison just shook his head, a smirk plastered on his face. 200 go in once, go in twice. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one last time, hoping for another bid that wasn't coming. Sold for $200 to Tom Miller. A low chuckle rippled through the men. Harrison clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard. "You bought yourself a real prize there, Tom. What are you going to do, plant flowers in it?" He walked away laughing, back to his circle of admirers. I ignored them all. I walked up to my new possession, the dead leaves crunching under my boots. I laid a hand on the cold, rusty sheet metal of the grain tank. It was solid. I ran my fingers over the flaking paint, feeling the heavy gauge steel beneath. $200. I'd spent more on a new set of tires for my pickup. In my mind, the gears were already turning, a long checklist of problems and solutions scrolling behind my eyes. The seized engine, the shot hydraulics, the rotted wiring, the bent auger. It was a mountain of work, a fool's errand according to everyone else here. But it was my mountain, and it was paid for. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what I was up against, the long nights and busted knuckles it took to breathe life back into that beast, I have to ask you folks watching, have you ever bought something everyone else called junk, knowing you could bring it back to life? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A tractor, a car, a piece of equipment. I read every single one. Because if you have, you know exactly the feeling I had standing there that day. It wasn't just about the iron. It was about proving something, mostly to myself. Getting the Massey home was the first battle in a long war. It sat 3 miles from my farm as the crow flies, but with 2 tons of dead weight and no wheels that would hold air, it might as well have been on the moon. Rich Harrison had made a big show of driving his new Chevy C60 grain truck past the Henderson place the next day, slowing down just long enough for me to see his grin as I stood there, staring at my prize. I came back with my Farmall M. She wasn't a powerhouse by 1970s standards, but that old girl was honest. She was born in 1948, the year my father took over the farm, and her engine had a steady, low RPM torque that could pull the devil himself out of the mud. I brought 2 log chains, the thick ones with the half-inch links, a hydraulic jack that leaked but still worked, and my toolbox. The first job was the tires. They were dry-rotted beyond saving, shredded and stiff as boards. I jacked up one of the massive front drive wheels, blocked the axle with oak timbers, and wrestled the wheel off. It took every bit of strength I had, using a 6-foot cheetah pipe on the lug wrench. I hauled all 4 of them, one at a time, in the bed of my pickup to the co-op. Old man Hemmings, who ran the tire shop, just whistled when he saw them. "Gonna make planters out of 'em, Tom?" he asked, poking at a crack you could stick your hand in. "Need 'em to hold air, Henry, just for a few miles." He spent the better part of the afternoon patching and tubing them, grumbling the whole time about wasting good tubes on junk rubber. When I got them back on the combine, they bulged and hissed, but they held. It was enough. The next problem was the steering. The hydraulic lines were shot. I couldn't tow it from the front. The rear wheels would just wander wherever they pleased. I had to pull it from the back, which meant I'd be dragging the big drive wheels. First, I had to get the transmission in neutral. I climbed up into the cab, the floor groaning under my weight. The seat was just springs and mouse-eaten foam. I grabbed the gear shift. It was frozen solid. An hour with a hammer, a pry bar, and a can of penetrating oil finally convinced it to move. I hooked the Farmall M to the combine's rear axle hitch. I took a strain on the chain, and the M's engine deepened its tone, the governor opening up. The big combine groaned, shuddered, and then, with a screech of tortured metal, it began to move. I was pulling it backwards, dragging it out of the fence row it had called home for a decade. The tires squashed flat, the rims nearly touching the ground, but they held. The 3-mile trip took 5 hours. I could only pull it in first gear, the Farmall's engine roaring, the exhaust stack puffing black smoke with every turn of the wheels. Twice I had to stop to let the old tractor cool down. The whole time I could feel the eyes of my neighbors as they drove past. They'd slow their pickups, shake their heads, and drive on. I was the county spectacle, Miller's Folly, they were already calling it at the coffee shop. I didn't care. I just kept my eyes on the chain, my hands on the wheel, and my foot on the clutch. By the time I dragged it into my machine shed, dusk was settling and a cold rain had begun to fall. I unhooked the chain and just stood there for a long time, looking at it. The shed, which had always seemed big enough for my 40-20 and my planter, was now dominated by this rusty red behemoth. It looked even worse under the bare electric bulb, every dent and patch of corrosion thrown into sharp relief. My wife, Sarah, came out with a hot cup of coffee. She stood beside me, her arms crossed, not saying a word. $200, I finally said, more to myself than to her. She took a slow sip of her own coffee. Well, she said quietly, it's inside now, out of the rain. That was all. She didn't question me, didn't criticize, she just trusted me. That trust was worth more than all the money in Rich Harrison's bank account. That winter became the winter of the Massey. With the crops in and the ground frozen, the machine shed became my world. I started by giving it a bath. Years of caked-on grease, dirt, and bird droppings blasted away with a pressure washer. Underneath the grime, the steel was pitted but sound. Then came the teardown. I started with the engine. The 390 Ford was a truck engine, a decent one in its day, but it had no business in a combine. It was seized up tight. I pulled the heads and found 2 cylinders full of rusty water. The block was cracked. It was junk. I unbolted it from the transmission housing and using a chain hoist rigged to the shed's main beam, I lifted the whole greasy mess out and set it in the scrap pile. Now I could see the heart of the machine. I spent weeks just taking things apart, methodically. Every bolt was a battle against rust. I went through 2 cans of penetrating oil and broke 3 wrenches. I labeled every part, every wire, every hydraulic line with a piece of masking tape and a grease pencil, laying them out on the concrete floor in the order they came off. The feeder house chain came off link by rusty link. The straw walkers were pulled, cleaned, and checked for cracks. The sieves, the grain augers, the unloading tube, it all came apart. Soon the shed looked like a combine had exploded, parts covering every square inch of space. The talk in town grew louder. Heard Tom Miller's got that old Massey scattered in a million pieces, they'd say over coffee at the diner. He'll never get it back together. Rich Harrison would just smile. A man's got to have a hobby, I suppose. The biggest challenge was finding a new engine. A Perkins diesel, the original type, was out of the question. They were expensive and hard to find. I needed power, but I needed it cheap. I spent my evenings poring over old farm equipment catalogues and talking to the old-timers at the co-op. One of them, a retired mechanic named Gus, gave me the idea. You know, he said, wiping his hands on an oily rag, back in the day, some fellas were putting big Chrysler industrial engines in those things. The 413. They used them in grain trucks and irrigation pumps, tough as nails, and they run on regular gas. The hunt was on. I checked every salvage yard in a 100-mile radius. Finally, in a dusty corner of a yard over in the next state, I found it. It was sitting in the chassis of a wrecked tandem-axle grain truck, covered in a blue tarp. A Chrysler 413 Industrial V8. It was ugly, but the dipstick showed clean oil, and when the yard owner hooked a battery to it, it turned over. We settled on a price, $300, and I had to pull it myself. I spent a whole Saturday in the mud and cold, wrestling it out of that truck frame, but I drove home with the heart of my combine sitting in the bed of my pickup. It had cost me more than the whole machine, but it was a start. The resurrection had begun. The years between 1973 and 1978 were like a fever dream for farmers in the heartland. It started with the Russian grain deal. Suddenly, the wheat and corn we were growing was feeding the world, and the prices shot to the moon. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly $1,000, then $2,000. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to get big, to borrow money, to plant fence row to fence row. The old rules of thrift and caution were thrown out the window. It was a new era, and the banks were the high priests of prosperity. No one embraced the new religion more fervently than Rich Harrison. He became the local poster boy for the boom. With the value of his initial land purchase doubled, he used it as collateral to borrow more, buying up 2 more farms that came up for sale. He tore out old fences and waterways, creating vast, unbroken fields. His operation was a sight to behold. He traded in his nearly new John Deere 7700 for a brand new International Harvester 1480 axial flow combine, the latest and greatest in harvesting technology. It was a beautiful machine, sleek and powerful, and it moved through a cornfield like a battleship cresting a wave. He bought a massive 4-wheel drive Steiger Panther to pull a 12-bottom plow. His grain trucks were new, his pickups were new, his wife drove a new Lincoln Continental. He was making a fortune, at least on paper. The coffee shop talk was no longer about my folly, but about Rich's genius. They talked about how many acres he was farming, the yields he was getting, the speed of his operation. He was a success story, proof that the old ways were for dinosaurs and the future belonged to men of vision and daring. Men willing to use the bank's money as a tool. Meanwhile, my world remained small and self-contained. The winter I rebuilt the Massey was followed by a spring of reassembly. The Chrysler 413, after a thorough cleaning and a new set of gaskets, dropped onto the Massey's frame mounts like it was made for them. I spent weeks fabricating new motor mounts, rerouting fuel lines, and wiring the ignition. I rebuilt the carburetor on my kitchen table one night, the smell of gasoline mixing with the aroma of Sarah's pot roast. By early summer, it was time. I filled the radiator with coolant, checked the oil, and put a fresh battery in. I poured a little gas down the carburetor's throat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The starter ground once, twice, and then the big V8 coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. It wasn't a quiet, smooth idle like Harrison's new turbo diesel. It was a loud, rumbling, angry sound that shook the whole machine shed. Black smoke billowed out the straight pipe I'd welded for an exhaust, but after a minute it cleared up, and the engine settled into a loping, powerful rhythm. I had never heard a more beautiful sound. That fall, while Rich Harrison was showing off his new axial flow, I took my resurrected Massey Ferguson 760 into the field for the first time. It wasn't pretty. The paint was a patchwork of Massey red, Chrysler blue, and rust-colored primer. The sheet metal had dents and weld marks. But it worked. The big V8 never bogged down, even in the thickest corn. The 6-row corn head I'd bought for $100 at another auction and rebuilt myself chewed through the crop without complaint. I sat in the open operator's station, the roar of the engine in my ears, the dust in my face, and a deep sense of satisfaction in my bones. I harvested my 320 acres, and then I did something else. I started doing custom work for some of my smaller neighbors, the ones who couldn't afford their own combines but were too proud to ask a big operator like Harrison for help. I charged a fair price, less than the going rate, and I was busy from sunup to sundown until the snow flew. The money I made was good. Grain prices were high and my operating costs were laughably low. I had no machine payments. My fuel bill for the gas-guzzling 413 was high, but it was nothing compared to the interest payments Rich Harrison was making every month. I didn't expand. I didn't buy more land. I paid my property taxes, bought my seed and fertilizer for the next year with cash, and put the rest of the money in the bank. I kept driving my old pickup. We kept living in the same small farmhouse my grandfather had built. To the outside world, I was a failure. I was the man who had missed the boat. At the co-op Christmas party, Harrison, a little drunk on whiskey and success, cornered me by the dessert table. "Still running that old junk heap, Tom?" he asked loudly so others could hear. "You know, with what you're saving, you could have made a down payment on a real machine. You could have another 100 acres by now. You're just not thinking big enough." I just smiled and took a bite of apple pie. "I sleep pretty good at night, Rich." He shook his head in disgust and walked away. The other farmers looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension. I was the relic, the stubborn old fool who refused to join the party, but I was starting to see things that they weren't. I was at the bank one afternoon to deposit the last of the custom harvesting checks, and I overheard my loan officer, a young man named Peterson, talking to another farmer. He was talking about the farmer's operating loan for the next year. "The rate is locked for now," Peterson said, "but you understand that all our new notes are moving to a variable rate, tied to the prime." The farmer just nodded, eager to get his money, not understanding the danger in those words. Variable rate. I didn't like the sound of that. Later that week, I saw a news report on the television. Walter Cronkite was talking about inflation, about interest rates set by a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. The numbers were ticking up. 7%, 8%, 10%. They were just numbers on a screen to most people, but to me they felt like the distant rumble of thunder on a clear summer day. I looked out my window at my machine shed where the old Massey sat, paid for and waiting. Then I looked east, towards Rich Harrison's massive, brightly lit operation, a sprawling empire of new steel built entirely on promises made to a banker, and for the first time I felt a cold knot of dread for him, and for all the others who were dancing so fast they couldn't hear the music starting to change. The first sign of trouble wasn't in the bank, but in the sky. The summer of 1980 arrived hot and breathless. The sky bleached to a hazy, washed-out blue and stayed that way. The rain simply stopped. By mid-July, the corn leaves, which should have been broad, green and reaching for the sun, began to curl inward during the day, a thirsty, desperate gesture to conserve moisture. The ground in my fields cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. The ponds on the back 40 shrank, their edges receding into wide, muddy rings of cracked earth. It was a drought that gripped the entire Midwest. It hit everyone, but it didn't hit everyone equally. For me, it was a worry. My yields would be down, maybe by half. My income would suffer, but my costs were fixed and low. For Rich Harrison, the drought was a catastrophe. He was farming over 2,000 acres, every single one of them mortgaged to the hilt. His operating loan for that year alone was more than my entire farm was worth. He needed massive yields, record yields, just to pay the interest on his debt. The withering corn in his endless fields represented the slow public death of his cash flow. The tension in the county was palpable. You could feel it at the diner, where farmers spoke in hushed, worried tones about the forecast. You could see it in Rich's face. The easy, confident swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent frown etched between his eyes. He drove faster, his jaw was always clenched, and the circles under his eyes grew darker. Harvest arrived in a cloud of dust. The corn was stunted, the ears small and poorly filled. The yield monitors in the new combines were telling a brutal story. I fired up the old Massey. The Chrysler 413 roared to life as always, a familiar, comforting thunder. I eased it into the field, the open station giving me no protection from the gritty dust that coated everything. Halfway through my first 80 acres, I heard a high-pitched squeal from the guts of the machine, followed by a loud bang and a shudder that shook the whole frame. I shut it down immediately. The main bearing on the separator cylinder had failed. It was a big job, a dirty job, but a straightforward one. I spent the rest of the day with wrenches and a pry bar, pulling off the heavy side shields. The next morning, I drove my pickup to the parts store in town and bought a new bearing and seals. $38.50. It took me another full day of sweat and cursing in the heat to press the new bearing on and get everything bolted back together. By the third day, I was harvesting again. My total cost for the breakdown, 1 bearing and 2 days of my own time. A week later, I was finishing up a field that bordered one of Harrison's. I saw his massive International 1480, a gleaming red giant, sitting silent in the middle of a row. That was unusual. With the weather holding, a man like Rich wouldn't stop for anything. I watched for an hour. It didn't move. The next morning, I saw the dealership's service truck out there, a shiny white Ford with the company logo on the door. A mechanic in a clean jumpsuit was working on it. Tools laid out neatly on a canvas tarp. The talk at the coffee shop the next day was all about it. The hydrostatic transmission had failed. It wasn't a part you could just unbolt and replace. It was the heart of the combine's propulsion system, a complex web of high-pressure pumps and hydraulic motors. The mechanic had to call for a crane. They ended up splitting the machine in two right there in the field to get the unit out. The bill, so the rumor went, was over $15,000, not counting the 4 days of lost harvest time waiting for parts to be shipped from a warehouse in Illinois. $15,000. It was more than most of the old-timers in the diner had paid for their first farms. Rich had to put it on his line of credit at the bank, borrowing more money just to fix the machine he'd borrowed money to buy in the first place. That was the first deep crack in his empire. People started looking at his operation differently. It wasn't a symbol of success anymore, it was a symbol of terrifying risk. The whispers started. They talked about the grain embargo President Carter had put on the Soviets, how it had knocked the floor out from under the market. They talked about the price of diesel, which had nearly doubled. And they talked about the prime interest rate. It was a number on the evening news that had always seemed abstract, something for Wall Street men in suits. Now it was a number that held the power of life and death over all of us. It had been 8% when Rich bought his last farm. Now it was 14, then 16, then 18. It was a runaway train, and hundreds of farmers in our county were tied to the tracks. Rich started selling things. First to go was the new Lincoln Continental. His wife was back to driving their old station wagon. Then one of his new tandem-axle grain trucks disappeared, replaced by a rusty single-axle from the 1960s. He was trying to stop the bleeding, trying to raise cash to satisfy the bankers who were now calling him daily. But it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. The swagger was completely gone now, replaced by the haunted, hunted look of a man who hears wolves circling in the dark. He didn't come to the coffee shop anymore. He didn't have time for boasting. He was too busy fighting for his life. The winter of 1981 was when the music stopped. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate war against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to 21.5%. The words variable rate, which had once sounded so modern and flexible, became a death sentence. For men like Rich Harrison, whose entire operation was built on a mountain of those loans, the effect was instantaneous and brutal. A monthly payment that had been $5,000 became $15,000. An operating note that cost him $40,000 a year in interest now cost him over $150,000, and that was before he even bought a single bag of seed or a gallon of fuel. It was a bloodbath. The bankers who had once taken him out for steak dinners and slapped him on the back now treated him like a stranger. They were just businessmen, they said. The notes were due. The land he had bought for $2,500 an acre during the boom was now struggling to fetch $1,000 at auction, but the loans he'd taken out were still for the original amount. He was upside down, buried so deep he couldn't see the light. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper like obituaries. First it was the smaller guys, the ones who had stretched to buy an extra 80 acres. Then it was the medium-sized operations. Finally, the unthinkable. A full-page notice, stark in its black-and-white finality, announcing the public auction of the assets of Harrison Farms Incorporated. Everything was listed: the land, the house, the grain bins, the Steiger Panther, the International 1480 axial flow combine. An entire empire, built on ambition and credit, was to be dismantled and sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. I was insulated from the storm. My life went on much as it always had. My property taxes were paid. I had no loans, no interest payments that changed with the wind from Washington. My income was down, sure, but I was still making a living. Sarah and I ate well. We kept the house warm. My old John Deere 4020 started every morning. In the shed, the Massey 760 sat silent, its job done, its value not on a banker's ledger, but in the simple fact that it was mine. I felt a strange, hollow ache watching it all unfold. There was no joy in seeing Rich Harrison fall. His arrogance had been grating, but he was a farmer. He loved the land in his own way. He had just believed in a new set of rules, and the men who wrote the rules had changed them in the middle of the game. He was a good farmer, a hard worker, but he had mistaken debt for wealth, and that was a fatal error. One afternoon, I had to go to the bank to get a cashier's check for a new set of planter discs. As I stood in line, I saw Rich at one of the loan officer's desks. It was the young man, Peterson, who had gotten his start by writing Rich's first big expansion loan. Rich was pleading, his voice low and strained. He wasn't the proud rooster anymore. He was a broken man, begging for more time, for any kind of lifeline. Peterson, the banker, wouldn't look him in the eye. He just kept shaking his head, shuffling papers, his face a mask of professional regret. Rich finally stood up, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and walked out of the bank without looking at anyone. I was the only one who saw the single tear that cut a clean path through the grime on his cheek. In that moment, he wasn't my rival. He was just another casualty in a war none of us had asked to fight. I owned my 320 acres. I owned my machines. I had a few $1,000s in a savings account. In the midst of the worst agricultural crisis since the Great Depression, that made me one of the wealthiest men in the county. The day of the Harrison auction was cold and grey, a perfect match for the mood of the crowd. It felt like a funeral. I stood at the back, just as I had at the Henderson sale a decade earlier. So much had changed, and yet nothing had. It was still a place of sorrow, where one man's life's work was being picked apart by others. The auctioneer's chant, fast and rhythmic, seemed obscene against the quiet despair. Rich was there, standing beside his wife. He looked 10 years older. His face was pale and drawn, his expensive work coat hanging loosely on his shrunken frame. He stared straight ahead, his eyes vacant, as the auctioneer sold off his legacy, piece by piece. The new grain trucks went for half what he'd paid. The planters and tillage equipment went for pennies on the dollar. The crowd was subdued, the bidding hesitant. No one was celebrating. Everyone knew it could just as easily be them. Then they came to the big-ticket items. The International 1480 Combine, the one that had cost him a fortune to buy and another fortune to fix, struggled to get a bid of $50,000. The bank representative, a grim man in a suit, reluctantly nodded his approval. Next was the Steiger Panther tractor. It was a beast of a machine, 4-wheel drive, articulated with 8 massive tires. It was barely 3 years old. "What am I bid for this beautiful tractor, folks?" the auctioneer called out. "Let's start it at 30,000. Silence. 30,000 was a lot of money, and nobody had it. The farmers who had survived were the ones like me, small and cautious, with no need for a tractor that big. 20,000, the auctioneer pleaded. "Give me 20. A scrap dealer from out of state offered 15. The banker's face tightened. He was about to lose his shirt on the machine. I saw Rich flinch, as if he'd been struck. That tractor had been his pride and joy. I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't right. I thought of my father's words, fear the banker. These men in suits, they were the only ones winning today. I took a step forward. 25,000, I said. My voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring crowd. Every head turned to look at me. The auctioneer's eyes widened. "I've got 25 from Tom Miller. Now 26. Who'll give me 26? The scrap dealer shook his head. The banker looked at me, a flicker of surprise on his face. He nodded at the auctioneer. 25,000 going once, twice, sold to Tom Miller. A low buzz went through the crowd. Miller, the man with the junk combine, had just bought the biggest tractor in the county. Then came the land. They sold it off in parcels. Finally, they got to the last piece. The original 160 acres his father had homesteaded, the piece with the house, the barns, the heart of the whole operation. The bidding was slow. The out-of-state land speculators were trying to steal it. I stepped forward again. I bid a fair price, what the land was actually worth. Not the fire sale price the bank was hoping to avoid, but the speculators were counting on. It was a strong bid, and it silenced them. It took most of the cash I had saved over the last 10 years, the money from the custom harvesting with the old Massey, the money from a decade of thrift. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a crack that echoed in the cold air. "To Tom Miller." After the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, I walked over to where Rich was standing alone by a fence post. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the house, his house, which was now my house. "Come to gloat, Miller?" he asked, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Come to tell me you told me so?" "No, Rich," I said quietly. "I didn't." I pulled a piece of paper from my coat pocket. It was a lease agreement I'd had the lawyer draw up the day before. "This is your home. It's always been your home. I'm leasing it back to you. The house, the barns, and 10 acres. Rent is $1 a year. You and your family aren't going anywhere." He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the paper, then back at my face. He didn't understand. "And one more thing," I said. "That Steiger is too much tractor for one man to handle. I'm going to need help running it next spring. I'll pay a fair wage, if you're interested." He stood there for a long moment, the lease shaking in his hand. The dam of his pride, the last thing he had left, finally broke. He covered his face with his hands and began to sob. Deep, wrenching sounds of a man who had lost everything and had just been handed an unexpected, undeserved piece of it back. I just stood there with him, my hand on his shoulder, until it passed. There was nothing more to say. The rivalry was over. 10 years later, by 1992, the world had changed again. The fields were green, land prices had slowly crept back up, and a new generation of farmers was cautiously taking the reins. My son, David, was 20 then, tall and strong, with my hands and his mother's quiet common sense. My farm had grown. I farmed my original 320 and the 160 I'd bought from the bank. Rich Harrison still lived in his family home, and he was the best hired man a farmer could ever ask for. He ran that Steiger tractor with a care and expertise that came from a deep, painful understanding of its true cost. We never spoke of the auction again, but a quiet respect had grown between us. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the machine shed with David. We were giving the old Massey its end-of-season maintenance. I had repainted it a few years back. It gleamed under the lights, its dents and welds like honorable scars. It was no longer Miller's Folly. It was a local legend. David was underneath, greasing the fittings, when he called out, "Dad, why don't we sell this old thing? Some of the guys are getting new combines again. Air-conditioned cabs, radios, all that stuff." I stopped turning the wrench I was holding and wiped my hands on a rag. I looked at the massive machine, at the Chrysler 413 engine I knew by heart, at the simple network of belts and chains that I could fix with my own two hands. "David," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the big shed. "Come out here." He slid out from under the machine, his face smudged with grease. I put my hand on the huge rear tire, the rubber still holding the dust of the last harvest. "Everything we have," I said, gesturing around the shed at the fields visible through the open door. "We have because of this machine, not because of what it harvested, but because of what it taught me." I told him the whole story, about the Henderson auction, about Rich Harrison's new 7700, about the boom years and the temptation to borrow and get big. I told him about the drought, the 21% interest, and the day of the final auction. "This combine," I said, patting its solid steel flank, "is the difference between wealth and the illusion of wealth. Rich Harrison looked rich. He had new machines, thousands of acres, but it was all just numbers on a banker's piece of paper. It wasn't real. What's real is owning the ground under your feet and the tools in your hands. This machine never sent me a bill. It never charged me interest. It asked for nothing but fuel, grease, and my own two hands. It taught me that the goal isn't to be the biggest, it's to be the last one standing." David looked at the combine, then at me. I could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at a piece of old iron anymore. He was looking at our history. He was looking at our survival. I handed him the wrench. "Now let's finish up. She's earned her rest." He took it and slid back underneath. I stood there for a long while, the smell of grease and old steel filling the air. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields I knew would be his one day. The land was safe, the family was secure. And in the quiet of my machine shed stood the rusty, roaring monument to a simple truth. A debt-free empire built not on what a man could borrow, but on what he could save.